What the entity keeps doing to him is genuinely horrifying.
No! No, God! No!
How are you still alive?
Look at him!
They wanted me.
This specific moment is so important to the story because the monsters literally tell us why the entity is so obsessed with Boyd specifically. Like, even after being forced to watch as they brutally tortured someone that he loves for an entire night and eventually killed her, Boyd was still ready and willing to fight back against the monsters less than a day after this happened. Like, it's honestly insane. But this scene also gives us undeniable proof that the dog is evil and has been working with the monsters this entire time.
I'm not gonna kill you, Boyd. You don't fucking break me. That's what she said.
You don't fucking break me!
Like, when you really think about it, when Boyd follows the dog after leaving the dungeon, it led him directly to the monsters. And even the very first time that we ever see it, it was the exact same story. And this is what I'm talking about. Like, this, it's not a coincidence. So, when you consider that it was literally this same dog that was watching Boyd when he was saying, "This place will not break him," I think it's more than obvious who this dog actually is. Because this is just one of the many clues that the scope of the entity's manipulation is much bigger than anything we have ever imagined.
You took someone I love. Where is she?
Where is she?
This scene, for example, makes it crystal clear that Father Katri and the kimono demon have always been the same being. Like, immediately after the kimono demon sends Boyd a photograph, less than a few seconds afterwards, Father Katri just magically pops up. Obviously, this was not an accident. Literally, the entire point of what was happening here was to delay Boyd from finding out Fatima's location, so that she actually had enough time to give birth to that demon in her belly. But there's actually far more evidence that clearly prove Father Katri is merely the entity himself trying to manipulate Boyd.
When I was in that chamber, a thing that was talking to me, telling me to give up, sure as hell wasn't my wife. So what are you?
What's most important to note about this scene in particular is that Boyd specifically says that just like fake Abby, who was obviously evil, Father Katri is always trying to get Boyd to give up and to stop fighting back against the monsters. Like, this scene was literally only included by the writers to tell us conclusively that there is a direct connection between these two beings and that both of them are working against the people of the town. To me, it's very likely that they are literally the same exact being that's just using multiple forms to trick the people of this town. But there's actually far more deception that you may not have noticed.
It's your move, Boyd. I gotta say, your options don't look great.
One of the biggest signs that he is in fact the entity is that Father Katri's first appearance was literally him playing chess and telling Boyd that it was his turn to make a move. Like, he's so obviously the entity that it's laughable, because this is clearly a reference to how the entity uses people like pawns on a chessboard.
This place will not break us. What happened today was a setback. We can still win. It's possible to fight back.
Like, with Boyd specifically, the entity uses him as a sort of counterbalance to the fear that it creates, because if you give people too much fear, they'll just end up killing themselves. So he has to ensure that the people believe that escaping or winning against the monsters is theoretically possible. That's why Boyd's survival is crucial to the entity, because as the symbol of hope, his existence ensures that the people are always going to be jumping back and forth on this endless emotional roller coaster of feeling incredibly hopeful to being in total despair. And of course, because the entity is clearly a narcissist, he can't ignore Boyd repeatedly saying that he can never break him. So he eventually has to prove to himself that he can actually break Boyd. I mean, after all, he can't allow himself to lose to a mere human. But this episode specifically gives us incredibly obvious evidence that everything has been clearly planned by the entity.
She took it down there.
And this right here is a very clear example of what's really happening in this town. Like, notice how despite the monsters obviously being able to see in the dark, which we know for a fact because of how they live down in those tunnels, there just coincidentally happens to be all of these very conveniently placed lanterns when Smiley is coming back to life. Obviously, this was done so that Boyd specifically would have a very clear view of the resurrection, like, the manipulation is truly insane. But this scene also gives us a massive clue that the kimono demon has been working with the monsters from the very beginning.
Alice, I saw what they did. They sacrificed their children.
Like, in this moment, we see very clear signs that everything has been a ploy. For example, notice how the kimono demon just happens to leave the trap door open when it's going down into the tunnels. And remember, this is literally the same door that ends up leading Boyd to see Smiley being reborn. Like, obviously, this was not a coincidence. The entity specifically did this because he wanted Boyd to see his attempt at killing Smiley was completely meaningless. This is important to understand because it's yet another clear sign that the kimono demon was always a part of the entity's plan to break Boyd's resolve.
About the dream. There was this boy, all dressed in white, kept repeating, "Here they come. They come for 3.
It's laughing at you for setting it free, for bringing it back to town. Here they come. They come for 3.
There are many signs showing a direct connection between the boy in white and whoever it is that's actually in control of the monsters. Like how when he tells Christopher that he needs to go to the bottle tree to save the children, Smiley just happens to be waiting at this specific tree, staging an ambush. But even if you want to say that was just a coincidence, man, maybe I would be willing to agree with you if this was the only time we've ever seen it happening, but it's not. Because when Tabitha was coming back into the town, just like with at the bottle tree, the monsters just coincidentally happened to have already set up a trap in preparation for her arrival. It's also very obvious that the boy in white was the one who brought Tabitha back into the town because he's literally the one who sent her out in the first place. So there's a lot showing that the boy is clearly working with the monsters, just like the kimono demon, Father Katri, Abby, and of course, the dog. But even if you want to ignore all of this, there's irrefutable evidence that there's far more trickery and deception by the entity than we have ever realized.
Boy, destroying that box isn't going to end their suffering. It's okay. None of this matters.
This scene stands out a lot to me because it makes it very obvious that everything has been a deception. For example, notice how fake Abby only chooses to appear right before Boyd smashes the music box. The reason why this is so important for you to see is that it means you don't need to be special in any way to see the entities of Fromland. They can appear to anyone in the town if they wanted to, they just choose not to do it. In the case of fake Abby, she only appeared because she was incredibly desperate to save the music box. It's crucial to understand this specific point because, for example, the Ankui kids could have chosen to appear to Jim Matthews, but they didn't. The reason to me is very obvious. They wanted Jim feeling isolated and alone, which was clearly done to set him up so that the man in yellow would kill him. But this also brings me to something that really should be getting more attention in this community because it's clearly very crucial to understanding this story.
They're in the diner right now, trying to figure out what it means that my mom got out.
What do you think it means?
Honestly, I don't think it means anything. This would make us suffer is to give us hope. Maybe that's why I let her out.
This dialogue from Julie is a perfect explanation of why the entity does what he does. But this scene is also a good explanation of the entity's severe manipulation of Tabitha in particular. Like, do you really think it's a coincidence that Tabitha just happens to be dragged back into the town only after she's already met Victor's dad, seen all the paintings, and even seen the bottle tree? And that shady-ass priest who just happens to tell her to look inside the lunchbox that just coincidentally happens to take her to Victor's dad's house? Like, come on. The signs have always been there. Everything we saw was designed by the boy in white to ensure a very specific outcome.
What is that? I looked at the notes. I could hear the music.
And the music just magically popped into your head. Doesn't that strike you as odd?
And this is a great showcase of how everything has clearly been a lie. Jade only hears the melody because the entity placed it in his head in the first place. And this is because he needed him to play the violin. And there's significant amount of evidence to show that this is conclusively the case. But the most damning for me is that the entity has allowed the existence of the bottle trees for literally hundreds of years. But there's also something else I want you to see.
You know why the phone is off the wall? Because it rang the other day. And the voice on the other end said his name was Thomas. Something here knows things about us. And it knows which buttons to push.
And this is a great showing of why the entity is so good at what he does. Like, even when you think about Smiley coming back to life, there's no proof whatsoever that this is the same Smiley that Boyd killed. Like, he could literally just be a clone. And we, as the townspeople, would have no way to tell the difference. And with the entity's ability to implant information into people's brains, verifying that it's actually the same Smiley becomes infinitely more difficult. But the entity knows that it doesn't actually matter, because that initial feeling when you see him coming back to life is gonna make it impossible for you to look at the situation from a rational and objective perspective. And that's the point. The entity doesn't want you to think. He wants you to feel like it makes sense. Like when you look at Father Cartry, he was literally about to kill himself, and then he just starts hearing a voice in his head claiming to be God, telling him that he was always a part of God's plan, which is obviously everything that he had ever wanted to hear as a literal priest. And even when you look at Elgin, he only started kidnapping pregnant women because the entity came to him looking like what he believed an angel to look like. And Jade, he didn't even recognize what happened because he was so happy to crack the code that he doesn't even question the logic of why or how it happened. And it's very important to pay attention to what we're seeing here, because the writers are clearly emphasizing just how incredible the entity clearly is at manipulating the people of this town.
I went through a magic tree and traveled to a lighthouse. Wake up in the hospital that you just happened to be here. No. This was your mistake.
What?
It's just more of this place torturing me. I need to pull over right now.
Like, this right here is an undeniable example of how insane the manipulation actually is. Because even when you think about Fatima, how did she even know about the child sacrifices in the first place? Well, because of what happened with Jade and the melody, it's obvious now that this information was placed into Fatima's mind by the entity himself. Because remember, Jim Matthews was specifically killed because he had too much knowledge. So for Jade, Tabitha, and even Fatima to be allowed to keep walking around, that makes it very clear that literally everything has been a deception. And we've barely even touched upon all of the evidence that shows this. And trust me when I say that there is a lot. But to put it simply, they are only being allowed to live because they're following the script as it's been written by the entity. Unlike someone like Jim Matthews, who was consistently going against the grand design. So the entity who's in control of the monsters simply decided it was better to remove him off the board entirely because he refused to play the game. It's also possible that Victor's mom herself was also killed for going off script because remember, the boy wanted Christopher specifically to go into the tree, not Victor's mom. So the massacre could have simply been a result of the entity throwing a tantrum like an entitled child because things weren't going the way he wanted. And this to me has to be one of the most compelling theories I've ever heard about the massacre because there's definitely a lot to support it.
Stop! You can't do that.
What happens if I refuse to play along?
No.
Do this!
But one thing that's becoming increasingly more evident as this story goes by is that Tabitha specifically has been following the entity's plans more perfectly than anyone else from the very beginning.